from Monday, May the 3rd through today, May 7th, to celebrate Cinco de Mayo, but also to commemorate the contributions, most importantly, made by Mexican women to the development of our nation. During 2021, the year of historical reconciliation, this panel is part of the activities organized by this consulate together with very important allies such as the academic institutions that are joining us today. And we are also celebrating very important events. Mexico Tenochtitlan, 7 centuries of history, with the main objective of promoting the feminist foreign policy adopted by the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today, we bring together a number of distinguished academic women from prestigious academic institutions, both in Mexico and in California. France, let me start by just saying, and please, I'm going to ask that everyone mute their microphones, and then we wait for each panelist to begin and open hers. But let me just very quickly give you a briefing of the importance of what we will be listening to today. France, Canada, Norway, and Sweden have officially promoted and announced that they have a feminist foreign policy. And in 2020, Mexico joined this very select group of nations by becoming the first Latin American country to adopt and implement a foreign policy of this type as well. The Mexican feminist foreign policy seeks to mainstream the human rights approach, the gender perspective, and intersectionality in all areas of Mexican foreign policy, including giving greater visibility to the contributions of Mexican women in foreign policy and in also their global actions. This is to give coherence, consistency by focusing both inside but also outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, inside of Mexico, but also outside of Mexico. So within the framework of the California-Mexico Advocacy Week, this Tuesday, May 4th, the Consulate General coordinated and promoted very important signing of a memorandum of understanding between our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls, signaling in this way a robust commitment to the promotion of gender equality and a feminist foreign policy by Mexico in California, but also by California in Mexico. And this is the first MOU of its type that the California government signs and hopes to guide it as a feminist foreign policy of California with its relations with other countries as well. The MOU focuses on strengthening Mexico's promotion of women and human rights, as I already stated, inside and outside. And why? Because women have been key contributors to the development in Mexico and in the United States. And this is a way of truly recognizing these contributions. We have leading figures in the progressive movements that have shaped lives on both sides of the border. And we could mention a number of examples of brilliant women who have made tremendous contributions to Mexican arts, sciences, and society, and that have deeply shaped our national identity and culture as well. Mexico's history is highlighted by the many contributions of women like, and we will be hearing in detail more about these women like Malinche, José Ortiz de Domínguez, the Soldaderas and Adelitas of the Reform and the Revolutionary Wars. The art and the sciences also have been tremendously impacted. Activism of Frida Kahlo, Aurora Reyes, Natalia Banquenados, Celia Calderón, Isabel Villaseñor, and we could mention so many more. Also, millions of indigenous women such as Lorena Ramirez, Erraramuri, ultra-marathon world champion is just one example of the resilience and the strength of our indigenous populations. So the exceptional talents are widely known. We also have today's prima ballerina of the Berlin Stadt Ballet, Elisa Carrillo Cabrera, chef Daniela Soto, recognized as the best chef in the world in 2019, a Mexican, mesmerizing musical arrangements by conductor Alondra de la Parra, dancers, wonderful dancers of the Ballet Folclórico de Amalia Hernandez, and the wonderful voices also of mezzo-soprano, for example, Oralia Jimenez and Miche soprano Maria Reina, among many others, are live testimony of the empowerment and the talent of contemporary Mexican women. I don't want to leave out brave women like Jovita Idar, a journalist that campaigned for women's rights to education, workers like Francisca Flores, Juanita Dominguez, Priscila Salazar, Dolores Huerta, who we admire so much, Enriqueta Vázquez, Elena Chavez, who through their activism and sacrifices shaped the Chicana movement, which has been a beacon of social justice and embodies the ongoing fight for gender equality and access to human rights of Hispanic women across the United States, let alone California. And of course, extraordinary Mexican and Latino women have contributed to US academics and have shaped in very important ways public policy and have shattered the glass ceiling, demonstrated that Latina women are capable of achieving all dreams. Elena Ochoa, first Hispanic woman to travel to space. Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard, first Mexican-American to serve as one of 12 chairs, the only 12 chairs of the Strategic House Appropriations Subcommittee at the federal level, and the first Latina to chair the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. So this is a truly special day for me with a truly magnificent panel. It is a great privilege for me to open and moderate the panel Women in the History of Mexico, organized by this consulate within the framework of the week that I already mentioned, together with very important California, US, and Mexican academic allies and friends. I would like hence to start by welcoming Dr. Camilla Townsend, Distinguished Professor of History at Rogers University, who will speak about one of the most enigmatic women in the history of Mexico, La Malinche, or Malinche. And I want to mention that Dr. Townsend has been very gracious. She's in the middle of the conference today, and she has taken time out to join us in order to present this very important subject. So our very, very special thanks, Dr. Townsend. Please, if we could start with you.
Thank you very much for that delightful introduction. Le agradezco a la gente del consulado. Hoy voy a hablar en inglés, pero si hay personas en la asistencia que prefieren comunicar sobre este tema en español, nada más que me manden un email en Rutgers University. De ahí seguimos en español, en castellano. But I will speak today in English. I will do a better job, and I think that will turn out to be the best. Okay. So my plan had been to speak only partly about Malinche and more about Nahuatl speaking or Aztec women in general, but perhaps we can shift that about in keeping with the interest of the consul and the audience, perhaps. Okay, I think it is very clear to everybody when we think about the women of the conquest era or the women of any period of warfare that women suffer in times of war. Okay? This is not a revelation. Okay? Women struggle in times of violence. They suffer the difficulties of being the ones in charge of putting food on the table in a time when food is scarce. Okay? They often suffer rape carried out for political reasons more than any other. Okay? So as we look around at the literature about women in the conquest, okay, the first crash between the cultures of the Nahuas and the other indigenous people and the Spaniards, okay, it is very easy for us to find materials detailing the sufferings of the women. They were very real, and I do not wish to make light of them. Indeed, when we think about Malinche, Doña Marina, the woman whom the consul has mentioned, she is in a sense a classic example of this. Her reputation in Mexico today is not of the best. That is, many people believe her to have been a traitor to her people. But when you look at her actual history, you learn that she had been kidnapped during times of war before the Europeans ever got there, that is, wars between the Native Americans, and sold to the Mayas, where she lived as a slave, as a concubine. And then when the Spaniards first defeated the Chontal Maya in a battle, she and 19 other women were given to the Spaniards as a peace offering, as slaves, as concubines. And it was in that dire circumstance, in that dreadful situation of having been transferred for a second time as a slave now to people whom she knew not at all. It was in that set of circumstances that she agreed to become a translator. She, in fact, was not an Aztec woman. As I mentioned, the Aztecs had attacked her people, and she had been sold by them as a slave to the Mayas. So she was not by any means betraying her own people. She was merely trying to stay alive, trying to avoid being given as a common property. A prisoner of war who was a woman would be given as common property, a concubine of all men present, or at least she risked that fate, a fate worse than death. I think many of us would agree. So she did what she could to stay alive, and in years to come did what she could, in fact, to save indigenous people's lives. There are plenty of indigenous texts talking about her, speaking to the people and trying to convince them that in the long run, more would suffer and more would die if they fought against the Spaniards than if they worked with them. So she becomes a classic example of a woman who suffers a great deal in the conquest and then responds with creativity and courage. Well, what I would like to say today is that many indigenous women did that very thing. Nahua women, Nahuatl-speaking women, women who spoke the Aztec language, were very politically active. It is not the case that before the conquest they were living in some sort of feminist utopia. I do not want to convey the idea that these were always women who were articulating their powerful political points of view as women and arguing with men or fighting against tradition. That would be nonsense. Okay? Everybody, male and female, old and young, noble and commoner, was expected to fulfill the role that the fates, that the gods had given to them. So I am not speaking about women demanding change in the same sense that we will be talking about later today when we get to the more modern period. What I mean when I say the Nahuatl-speaking or the Nahua women were politically active is that they were very public figures before the conquest, very vocal, so that if an injustice was done to their village, to their people, to their family, they were it was perfectly allowable for them to speak loudly about their needs, their people's needs, their families' needs, etc. They were not silenced at all. There was no expectation that they would not participate in public discourse or dialogue, and they very much did. In fact, often the women's voices were remembered in the histories that the Nahuas later wrote, male Nahuas that they wrote in their own language. The women's voices were sometimes remembered as the loudest and the clearest. So let's give a couple of examples so it doesn't just sound like that, profesora insisting on something that may or may not have been the case. Okay, in the Shupo Huali, the year count, the annals that the Nahuas wrote in their own language, that I have spent about 20 years now, I'm getting old, that I have spent a long time reading, they are recorded as having argued for their point of view very clearly in a number of different ways. So, for example, if their menfolk were losing a war and the women feared with justification that they were going to become prisoners of war who were then taken and sold the way Malinche experienced. They would sometimes, at the very end, towards the end of the battles, but before a truce had been asked for, go out and fight themselves. No one expected that they would be able to turn the tide of battle if their menfolk had not. But it was a sort of a way of saying, we defy you, you the enemies who are about to defeat us. Till the very end, until you have us bound and tied and your prisoners, we defy you. When I first read this, there's a commonly quoted instance of this in the work of a friar, Fray Diego Duran. When I first read it, I didn't believe it. I thought this is a Spanish man making this up. But again, I have now found instances of this recorded in Nahuatl for other Nahuas. These Shupowali were not written for Spaniards. They weren't written for us. They were written for each other and for their own grandchildren. So if they mention this, then I believe it. We often find in songs, women's point of view represented. The women may have sung the songs, or it may have been men who were singing the songs, but women characters are represented in these songs. And so, for example, after Chalco was defeated by the Mexica, by the people of Tenochtitlan, by the Aztecs, they were not allowed at first a place at the council table. They were treated as fully conquered beings, and nobody liked that. And there was a pop song that was performed, we know, first in the 1470s and then again even after the conquest, in which the Chalkans likened themselves to a concubine, a prisoner of war. And they said, this is not right. Of course, we understand that when people are conquered, they might have the experience of being a concubine. We accept that, but you must treat us decently. You must treat us with kindness. You must treat us with respect. You must not treat us like chattel slaves. Okay, this was all put to music, and we have the lyrics. Okay, so people of the time expected that women might complain, okay, and that women might speak clearly of what they viewed was an injustice to their people. There are also records of people, women, simply rioting before the conquest, saying, you cannot do this to us. Well, what I think is very interesting for the purposes of today's panel is that this expectation that women had the right to speak continued past the conquest. That is, they suffered war as we would expect them to. There are stories of women being raped by Spaniards, of women crying out in their pain, of women who had been taken prisoner by the Spaniards and raped, refusing to go back to their people after the battles were ended because they were so ashamed. So they did suffer, and I do not wish to deny that. Okay? But they were still Nahuatl-speaking women. They were still Aztecs. They were still Mexica and other indigenous and of other indigenous cultures. And so they still had, in years to come, this tradition of speaking their minds. And we find numerous examples of this in the early colonial period in the 1500s. One that is very striking occurred in 1564. The people of Tenochtitlan of Mexico City had not been asked to pay tribute. The Spaniards had relied on them to help rule the rest of Mexico, and they had asked them to build the buildings. The great city of Mexico City was at first largely built by indigenous workers. So they had contributed, but they had not been asked to pay a head tax like every other Native American group had been, because they were, again, the Spaniards depended on them. Well, in the 1560s, the Spaniards felt for the first time that they were so powerful and had so much control over the people of the valley, the Valle de Mexico, that they said, now you, the Aztecs, the people of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica, you will pay tribute too. Well, the people, the indigenous people were enraged because they felt they did not have a way of raising the money. The Spaniards told the indigenous, sell some crops, sell your harvests for cash and pay us. But the people of Tenochtitlan were mostly artisans. They mostly did not have farms. So they had no way of collecting this money. The only way they were going to be able to do it, they said, and the women said, was if the women worked even harder and sold the cotton that they had spun, or the fabric they had woven, or the sweaters and blouses, the huipiles that they had made. And as you know, they did begin to do that, and indigenous women have been selling their craft work ever since. Well, they didn't like this. That is, that the women did not like it, that they were going to have to work even harder than they already were to raise this money to pay the head tax. And strong politically motivated riots erupted. I'm going to read you my translation of something that comes from one of these shupohuali, one of these histories that were written in Nahuatl. Don't worry, not too long, just a bit. Okay, a great gathering was held in July of 1564, and there were men and women present, but the women were remembered as being among the loudest. The hubbub, the commotion grew bigger and bigger. The people went on to say, oh, maybe the lords, the noblemen who were caretakers of the Altepet, of the community, could have made one last gamble on our behalf. They meant, could have argued better on our behalf. Okay, you noblemen come out after you have helped to impose upon us what tribute we are to pay. Okay. Did Cuauhtemoc gamble anything in the last past? Did he say anything he wasn't supposed to say? They're referring here in 1564 to what had happened years ago in 1521, and they're saying, didn't Cuauhtemoc make some sort of an effort on our behalf? Okay. They said many other things, and some of the women said, villains, bring down Terknu and Cocolot. These were some of the indigenous leaders that they were so angry at for having agreed to this with the Spaniards. Okay. There was more raging and shouting, and they insulted the governor himself for staying in power beyond the time that he should rule. A man named Pedro Marcelki jumped in, separating the people and restraining them. He had his staff of office on his shoulders. Suddenly, they grabbed it from him and were going to kill him. They ganged together to kill him. They pulled his shirt off. Naked was how they left him. They got him, but Juan Cano, a Spaniard, got him out. The Spaniard took his sword so that they would let him through. Otherwise, that man would have died at the people's hands. And while the people were crying out, everybody was gathering on the rooftops, the Spaniards' big rooftops. And some ran about to hear what was happening. Some ran away home. The women doing business, selling all sorts of things at the market, they all came. And the people in the houses also came out, even the old women, the children, and all the people. They threw stones at the upper floor of the building. They actually destroyed a carving that ran around the wall. Then a Spanish officer came and took out his sword and chased the people. The Spaniards and some of the mestizos who were there all took out their swords and dispersed the people. But the women broke through the patio wall on the left side of the Palacio de Gobierno, okay? Broke through the patio wall on the left side, okay? And then they fell, and men just climbed over them so that they fell back and screamed and shouted. Many of them got hurt, and one old woman's face really got hammered. So they go on to tell more about the protests, and the leading indigenous governing figures who are responsible for making the people pay, or they will go to jail, arrest many people, but especially a number of women, and have the women publicly whipped. The men keeping this record, keeping this history in Nahuatl, were particularly enraged about that even, not only were the women going to have to come up with the money, but that the women had also been publicly whipped. He felt it wrong. The writer felt that women should be allowed to shout their opinions, defend their people, and not be whipped for it. This was well within the understanding of what was culturally appropriate, that women should stand up for their people and say what they were thinking. Well, as you know, the women did find the money. They did weave and spin and embroider, and they did sell their goods, and they found the money. They also eventually came to accept this new status quo. It was very important to them that they make peace, okay, with the government, that they accede to their demands, because they did not want their children to continue to live with violence. Okay? So at that point, the indigenous women took the lead, as Malinche had before them, in making peace and working things out, so that the children would grow to be the next generation of Mexicans. I wish I could stay longer, but as the consul said, I'm afraid that I have to go. I hope that this talk will have served as a sort of background for all that is going to be talked about as the rest of the historians speak about the 19th, 20th, and even 21st centuries. It is a reminder that the women of Mexico have long had a strong point of view and have long been courageous.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Townsend. What an honor, what a privilege, and what a beautiful way to begin. And also this message of peace and the sacrifices and cost that many times, despite the courage and la valentía that women have shown and the intellectual capacities that always, how we attempt or try at least to privilege peace. So thank you so much, Dr. Townsend. Wonderful start. Thank you very much. This has been a true privilege. We go on now to Dr. Margaret Chowning. This is wonderful, Dr. Margaret Chowning, that you were able to join us. Thank you so much. Dr. Chowning is professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. How lucky can we be? And she will be speaking about women in politics during the 19th century. So Dr. Chowning, welcome to the seminar. We are very, very honored to have you join us. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. I'm glad I finally found the right link to join you. Here are some words of wisdom from the Mexican Catholic press around 1900 on the subject of feminism. What is feminism? Is it a good thing or bad? It is evident that it is bad, since it leads to the perversion of the woman and the destruction of the family. We have always believed and believe that the place for women is in the interior of her home, as long as she has a father, a husband, a brother, someone to take care of her. We don't wish for the so-called emancipation of the woman in the sense that certain feminists mean, that is, that they want to be like men. And finally, whatever the feminists may say, woman was born for the home, to fulfill the saintly functions of daughter, husband, sister, wife, and mother, not for either business or politics. The home is her throne and sanctuary. This is probably not that surprising to you. Most people see the church as a profoundly male-dominated institution, even a misogynist one. But 50 years before this language about feminism was published, it can be argued that the Mexican church, the Catholic press, and Catholic women behaved and talked like feminists. That, I think, is surprising. First, a very brief but necessary bit of background. Catholic women first began to look like feminists in the context of their leadership of lay associations or cofradías. So for those of you who don't know what a cofradía is, here's a quick definition of the colonial cofradía, that is lay associations before Mexican independence in 1821. Let me see if I can make the share screen work. No. Okay. We'll live without the pictures. Cofradía's main role was to organize devotional practices that honored a saint or a divine figure. So they sponsored masses, cared for the image to which the cofradía was dedicated, took the image out into the streets on procession day, organized extravagant annual fiestas on the saint's special day. The majority of cofradías were complex institutions with business interests and large budgets. They owned property, they loaned money, they spent a lot of money. Perhaps because of this intense business role, but mainly because it was just seen as the natural order of things, no one questioned in the colonial cofradía that men should be the leaders and the officers in the organization. But the colonial cofradia hit a crisis at the time of Mexican independence from Spain. What happened? Basically this: the complex and expensive cofradias began to fall apart under the financial pressures of the devastating wars for independence. This seems to have happened in such a way that in some parts of Mexico, the cofradias could not recover. Without cofradias, religious practices in the church were impoverished. The cofradias had done a lot to enrich religion, and without them, religion was impoverished. So the crisis of the cofradias was, in a real sense, a crisis of the Catholic Church. The solution came in 1839 when 31 women in the small town of San Miguel de Allende proposed to organize a new, simpler lay association that could be led, in fact, by the terms of their constitution, was required to be led by women. This was the Vela Perpetua, which organized women to sit vigil 2 by 2 in front of the tabernacle that housed the Blessed Sacrament from 6 in the morning until 6 at night every day. Any man who wanted to join was welcome, but when men did join, they were to be governed by female officers. This was a revolutionary moment in the history of women's relationship to the church. Mixed gender cofradias simply did not elect female officers. Women couldn't govern men. The bishop dawdled, put it off, approving it, but under the dreadful economic circumstances, priests really needed the help that women were prepared to offer. And after much passing of the buck, the vela was finally approved, and it spread rapidly throughout the parts of Mexico where the old cofradias were no longer very functional, eventually spawning other female-led lay associations. And indeed, by 1897, a survey of cofradias or lay associations in the Archbishopric of Mexico reveals that almost 85% of these associations were either all female or mixed gender with female leadership, 85%. Okay, so now we have the background we need, and we can begin to explore the question of Catholic feminism from a political perspective. While the Vela Perpetua, with its call for mandatory female leadership and its provision for women to govern men, gives us one insight into the question of whether Catholic feminism is an oxymoron, the press scarcely took note of women's lay associations or the revolutionary nature of the Vela's organizational structure. But it did pay attention when women in those lay associations began to act in a political way, to enter the political arena. The first petition campaign in which women's participation caused a ruckus came in 1856. The issue was a proposal to include religious tolerance in the new constitution, which would mean the end of Catholicism as Mexico's official church. About 17 petitions from women all over the country condemning the proposal were received out of about 70 total. When the first of the women's petitions was received, it was met with astonishment, according to a leading liberal paper. From the liberal point of view, this was a world turned upside down. Quote, "When the weaker sex leaves her sphere in order to take part in public matters, she is as out of place as a member of the stronger sex dedicating himself to domestic chores." Given women's supposed moral superiority and therefore their influence in matters such as religion, liberals were desperate to diminish the impact of the women's petitions, and they did so by a variety of means, most notably by denying that women had any agency in the writing of them. The clergy, orated one congressman, not finding enough support among the men, has gone in search of it from the women. And here I would have shown you a picture of the archbishop and bishops reaching around solid middle-class women, holding their hands while they signed these petitions as an indication of how little agency women had in the petitioning process. From some women, they have extracted their signatures by using the element of surprise, from others by demanding compliance, from some perhaps by appealing to their vanity, and from all of them by deception, making them believe that religion was in danger. The church, wrote a liberal editor, has compromised all the wives, daughters, and even the servants of the conservative families, undermining the decorum and timidity that are natural to women, so that they will throw themselves upon the political barricades without regard for how ridiculous this makes them look. The Catholic press also had to come to terms with women's entry into politics. They didn't really believe that women belonged in politics any more than the liberals did. How did they finesse what looked like a very unnatural thing and make it work for them? First, they emphasized that women entered politics reluctantly. The ladies of Mexico have never interfered in politics in even the most limited way before, wrote one newspaper, and would not do so now but for the grave threat of Protestantism. Second, conservatives drew a distinction between intervening in politics and intervening in religion. And third, relatedly, they insisted that the signers of the petitions were not ignorant or manipulated, but rather respectable women who knew exactly what they were doing. They had agonized about whether or not to enter politics, according to the Catholic press, and in the end had chosen to defend God and the church. They had, quote, as much capacity to think for themselves, to reflect, to make judgments, and to decide their positions as men. The Catholic press then made the decision in 1856 to accept women, probably with some misgivings, as partners in their political projects, just as parish priests had, perhaps reluctantly, made the decision to accept women as leaders of lay associations in their towns and neighborhoods a decade and a half earlier. Whether we want to characterize either the acceptance of women in politics or the acceptance of women as church leaders as a feminist position, I think it's clear that the principle of gender equality in an institution that was, of course, built on the rock of gender hierarchy had been introduced. In a perfect world, from the conservative point of view, neither women presidents of lay associations nor women in politics would be necessary. But that was not the world in which the church existed in the middle of the 19th century. What about the women themselves? Middle class and elite women in 1856 tended to be highly deferential in tone and distinctly not feminist. Here are the women of Mexico City in their petition. If it is ever appropriate for the weak voice of women to be heard before the august National Assembly, it is without doubt on a vital matter of particular concern to our sex, our religion. We do not mean to insinuate ourselves into the difficult questions of politics, which are foreign to our sex. We come only to ask for what we love more than life, the preservation of our religious beliefs and the integrity of our families. My conclusion is that in 1856, Catholic women were uncomfortable in these new roles and were actually less feminist than the Catholic press was prepared to be on their behalf. But this changed by the time of the second major entry of women into politics. In December 1874, a law was passed by the Congress that was meant to establish clearly, once and for all, the principle of the subjugation of the church to the state. The law set off the second great Catholic petition campaign. This time there were many more petitions than in 1856, over 300, and almost 60% of them came from women. This time around, while some women continued to protest that they did not feel their sex should be involved in politics, others struck a decidedly fiery and even militant tone. The protests sent by the Señoras of Guanajuato set the standard for angry petitioning. It was shockingly intemperate, immodest, and aggressive. Far from apologizing for their entry into politics or trying to disarm their readers by saying that they knew politics was not the proper realm for women, the Señoras of Guanajuato wrote that they not only had the right, but the duty to vent their anger at the iniquity of the delegates who had voted for the law. Quote, "You have caused so many tears to be shed that they exceed the volume of liquor that you guzzle at your banquets." The señoras then went on to characterize, quote, men who call themselves Catholic, end quote, as peace-loving Quakers, and they swore to disown their brothers, husbands, and even sons who participate in the execution of these laws. This petition by the women of Guanajuato actually reminds me of what Professor Townsend was, the words of the Mexica women condemning Cuauhtemoc for not doing what he should have done. Here are the Catholic women of Guanajuato condemning Catholic men for not doing enough to protect the church. What do we make of the differences between the 1856 women's petitions and the ones in 1874-75? Let's look briefly at the liberal reception of the 1875 petitions. There were a few lingering comments, such as those of one writer to the effect that women, quote, precisely because of the delicacy of their sex and the gentleness of their hearts, should abstain from politics, end quote. But it was now much more common for the liberal press to be vicious and satirical. One newspaper, for example, featured on the front page a piece ridiculing Catholic women's shallowness, commitment to, and understanding of politics. The author imagined conversations between two girls, Lola and Lupe, and their two mothers. The dialogue begins with the girls. Did you already sign the protesta, Lola? Of course, chula. You know that it is all the vogue to protest. How many times have you protested? Just once. Well, I have signed 4 times. Ay, where can I go to protest more? I want to protest 10 times. Meanwhile, the mothers were sharing strategies for racking up more signatures. And you haven't even sent your maids to go protest? What do you think, Juanita? The maids are so useless. Yesterday, I allowed the bedroom maid and the seamstress to go out to sign a protest, but they went on a canoe ride in Santa Anita. What about getting Lucecita to sign? But she's only 3 years old. It doesn't matter. Why not? Listen, Nina, why don't you come with us to look for signatures? All of us in the Vela Perpetua go around collecting signatures. We go into the tenements, which besides being a good work, because many women sign, is a lot of fun. And now back to the daughters. Do you worry that people will say we should not interfere in matters that don't concern us? Don't worry about them, chula. I'm content for now with my 4 protests, but I can't wait for Congress to open, because if they present a budget, then I will protest and go out and collect signatures. If they pass a railroad law, I'll protest again. Whatever they do, I will protest. We'll see who wins, them with their laws or us with our protests. Very good, my child, says one of the mothers. Above all, we must defend religion, even if it means having to leave your boyfriends. Oye, Lola, is it really necessary to leave our boyfriends? When it is necessary, we will do it. Didn't you see that the señoras of Guanajuato have renounced their children, their fathers, and their husbands? Well then, this is serious. The conservative press coverage of the petition campaigns changed more fundamentally between the 2 episodes. By the 1870s, conservatives were active and enthusiastic supporters of women's roles in politics. They even went on the offensive against liberal hypocrisy regarding women's rights, making fun of the liberals' continuing insistence that women should stay home and not enter politics. What happened, one paper asked sarcastically, to emancipation? Now it's not convenient anymore. We see it this way. When a mother's husband, brother, etc. allows a woman to protest, it is not because he is dominated by skirts, but out of respect for freedom of opinion and of conscience, a glorious victory of the century of light. This is a conservative newspaper. The massive protests and their publication in a collection called El Libro de las Protestas showed that, according to one Catholic commentator, you, señoras, have shown yourself to be more politically astute than the politicians. Okay, thus change over time from the first petition drive up to the beginning of the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship in Mexico in 1876 among both Catholic writers and Catholic women was toward more gender equality, more feminism. There was more willingness on the part of Catholic men in the church to entertain the idea that women had a role to play that was not just mother, wife, sister, daughter, but also a political role. There was also more willingness on the part of Catholic women to embrace those roles. Things quieted down during the dictatorship of Diaz from 1876 to 1910. The Diaz government was relatively friendly toward the church, and there were fewer occasions on which Catholic women or Catholic men felt the need to protest government actions. Women, however, did not retreat from leadership of lay associations, and this meant that they did not truly retreat from politics, because the new political agenda of the church after 1876 to develop Catholic culture, foment Catholic morality and values was right in their wheelhouse. They didn't have to petition or march or protest to be politically influential. The Catholic women were still politically aware, as suggested by the fact that during and after the Revolution of 1910, women re-entered politics as governments condemned the church and the influence of Catholicism, attempted to shut down churches and Catholic schools, and in the 1930s mandated socialist education, including sex education. Interestingly, they were now joined by Catholic men who were politically active as never before. This was most notable during the Cristero War, the religious war in 1926 to 1929, but we see men involved in Catholic politics as early as the turn of the century, as well as during the pro-family anti-government protests of the 1930s. So in conclusion, I just want to pose the question of why Catholic men are now getting involved after having allowed Catholic women to bear a major political role in the defense of the church during the 19th century. I have two speculations. The first is that the sons of the Catholic mothers, who were like the señoras of Guanajuato, who had done so much to keep Catholic practices alive and vibrant at the local level, were more inclined than previous generations of Catholic men to become activists. One such political actor was José de León Toral, who was the one who assassinated President Álvaro Obregón in 1928 in the middle of the Cristero War. Toral's mother and other Catholic women were major influences in his life. The second speculation is that Catholic activism around the time of the Revolution came to be seen by men as a more masculine endeavor than it had been in the 19th century. Strongly associated with femininity during the 19th century, the lead up to the Cristero War and the war itself made it possible for decades to come for Catholic men to think of the defense of the church as something that was not emasculating, but rather masculinity affirming, as the revolution was for liberal and radical men. Finally, what about women and Catholic feminism? I see it this way. When women were empowered by the church, as they were in the beginning in the middle of the 19th century, they became more enmeshed in it, more committed to it than before. They could only grow as feminists within the church as long as the church allowed it. And as we know, there were limits on the extent to which the church was willing to allow this. To return to the quotes I read at the beginning of this presentation, to the church it was evident that feminism was bad and unnatural. Catholic women repeatedly helped restore the church to a position of strength when it was threatened, but once it regained its strength, like an elastic band, it snapped back to its natural embrace of gender hierarchy, and women, more linked to the church than ever before, went along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Margaret Chowning. For those of you that are just joining us, we're being live streamed via YouTube as well, and Twitter and our social media. We have had a wonderful, wonderful group of distinguished academics. We started with Dr. Camila Townsend, Professor of History at Rutgers University, and Dr. Margaret Chowning, Professor of History at University of California, Berkeley, just ended her presentation. First, we heard about Malinche, and Indigenous women, and now we just ended a presentation with women in politics during the 19th century. The next speaker, it is my great, great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Itza Varela Huerta. She's in charge of the program of interdisciplinary gender studies at the very prestigious El Colegio de México. She will highlight the important but often or lesser known roles played by Afro-Mexican women in the political arena in Mexico. El Colegio de México is very, very close to my heart. Dr. Varela, my father, graduated many years ago as the first generation of international relations students in the early 60s. And now I have a niece that just joined the international relations program at El Colegio de México. And I have many, many respected friends. So I feel very privileged. We all know the respect that we all have for El Colegio de México and its academics. So thank you for joining us. Dr. Itza Varela will be speaking in Spanish, but we will have simultaneous translation. I want to thank my colleague, Juan Carlos Ruiz, who will be helping out with simultaneous translation. And thank you once again, Dr. Itza Varela, please.
Thank you, Sandra, for such a nice presentation, and hi, everyone. I prefer speaking in Spanish because it's easy for me, and I'm very honored for the invitation, so I hope Juan and I make a very good equipo.
Perfect. Of course. Perfect. Yes. She's going to make a quick, brief movement around the history of the organization of Afro-Mexican women of Costa, Chica in the 20th century. This movement, the Afro-Mexican movement, started in Oaxaca and Guerrero around the 90s, the decade of the 90s, end of the 20th century. And it's a movement that includes both male and female, women and men, and that recognize themselves as Afro-Mexican. However, it is important to highlight that at the beginning, this movement sought to highlight the Afro-Mexican ethnicity, but without a gender perspective. The topics about gender were not included at the beginning in this ideological ethnical movement. Yes. Sorry, could you repeat that, Doctor? I lost you there for a second. The first demands of this movement were the constitutional recognition and also to include or demand that the question about Afro-Mexican Black ethnicity should be included in the census. And bring to the fore this movement of Afro-Mexican population that have been invisible since the 19th century. and also change this narrative about the ethnicity of the Afro-Mexican people in the 20th century that included lots of misconceptions and myths. And even when women have been participating in this movement from the 90s onwards, they always made it from a general approach rather than a gender approach, generalistic approach of the ethnicity rather than gender. Under the logic of the movements, the political ideological movements that were happening in those days, they had to do it that way. Like, for example, cooking or organizing visitors from abroad or different parts of the country. Invite people from other towns to participate in the assemblies and in the festivities of the Afro-Mexican people. And it is not until 2012 that women really start engaging in the conversations about female and gender issues or problems that women were facing on a daily basis. But not only the problems related of being a woman from African descendancy in the Costa Chica, but also around the problems that girls and teenagers and all ages of female gender were facing at different stages in the lifestyle, and including now problems and necessities and needs, demands and ideas of the LGBTQL plus community. So truly from 2012, the fight of Afro-descendant women, Afro-Mexican descendant women, started having two major lines of work. The first one was within the movement, within look of the Afro-Mexican movement, to put in the agenda the discussion of gender, the discussion of gender inequality and differences between ages and lifestyles. And the second one, the recognition of the Afro-Mexican movement with the Mexican government to bring to the fore the existence of this ethnicity, this ethnical conception group termed Afro-Mexicans. So it is important, and it's interesting from my perspective to start paying attention to the different types of discourse, of feminist discourse that exist within this movement. And amongst them, we have all these discussions regarding intersectionality and feminism and intersectionality and Black ethnicity. the construction of the Mexican identity from the 19th century onwards without this group, basically making them the invisible. And racism and the multiple effects that it has on the daily lives of women and Afro-Mexicans in general. These discussions are not just academic, but also epistemological in the Mexican movement. It is important, therefore, to bring to the fore this annual movement of Afro-Mexican women that gather every year to discuss the multidimensional aspects of what it means to be Afro-Mexican and a woman within this group. And how these political gatherings have spawned the opportunity to create new proposals of recognition and new spaces, the opening of new spaces for the Afro-Mexican women, and in general for this community, in this intersectionality with academia and government. From these perspectives, these gatherings of women have created networks and important networks of cooperation amongst institutions. Organizations of indigenous women and mixed race and mixed ethnical groups. And networks also with the academia, both with male and female academics. It is important to remember that the relationship that the Afro-Mexican ethnicity historically has had with the indigenous ethnicities of Mexico has been a continuous source of change over time. Historically, it has meant different things. And in these Afro-Mexican women gatherings, the construction of the Afro-Mexican racial identity it is attached with the color of the skin, but equally strongly with a cultural identity. It is very important to not lose sight that both of those elements play a role in the identity of Afro-Mexican people. The color of their skin, but also the cultural identity. And particularly to understand the communities of Costa Chica, we need to focus in their cultural shared identities. Particularly if we want to understand the different policies that are being put in place, which differ from other policies that try to tackle gender inequality and discrimination. I've worked for the last 13 years with different organizations in this region called Costa Chica. And I have been able to listen to the perspectives of multiple groups, and particularly what we call womanism, or fight for women, or gender fight. And from this perspective, there is an active discussion within these organizations as to whether one is or is not feminist, depending on the approach it takes. Because perhaps for the elderly women that have participated on this movement right from the beginning, recognizing themselves as feminists might carry certain negative connotations. And this is to do with the fact that feminism has been misrepresented in various spaces of debate, of communications, and it's misunderstood what exactly it means. However, among the younger women in these groups, it's very easy to recognize themselves as feminists. And some of them even recognize that feminism in Mexico, it's really a white movement. So it doesn't even include all women. It's a race separation that doesn't include Black women. It is important to make a difference in our understanding and approach of feminism and women's fight. Because in this debate, other groups are also included, such as indigenous women organizations. Who insist that the feminism of the central part of Mexico tends to be exclusive of non-white women. Many of the feminist women of Costa Chica region recognize themselves as Afro-Indigenous feminists. And others retake the idea of the Zapatista National Liberation Army of the region of Chiapas and the idea of indigenous women and women of indigenous ancestry. So to give you a reference that might help you understand best is a very brief history of feminism and the Afro-Mexican movement in this region. I would like to recommend you this reading from who, doctor? From Julian Acevedo. She is a lawyer and an Afro-Mexican activist in Mexico. Who published a book called The Fight of Black Peoples of Mexico. Edited by the Supreme Court of Mexico. and that you can find it easily online. And just to start closing with a conclusion about this Afro-Mexican movement of women. I propose to rethink the actions and the political gatherings of these women as actions of care for life in the face of ruthless capitalism. And in favor of an Afro-Mexican memory that might describe and include the communities that belong to this important Mexican group, the Afro-Mexican community. And now, just to close, I would like to say that one of the main demands of women, other than women health and babies' health, children's health, is to stop the murder of women from this and other ethnicities in Mexico, who sadly has become a big problem. Thank you very much for your time, and I apologize for not speaking in English.
No reason to apologize, Dr. Itza Varela. Thank you so much. What a privilege, and thank you for this very, very powerful and important message that you just shared with us at the very end. Thank you very much. Itza Varela Huerta, Program of Interdisciplinary Gender Studies at Colegio de Mexico. Thank you for highlighting the importance of the role played by Afro-Mexican women. And now we end with a wonderful, wonderful presentation of a very timely subject. Dr. Natalia Dibsosa, thank you so much for joining us today. Chicano Studies, University of California, Davis, my alma mater, so I couldn't be happier. She will be giving us a perspective of the complex challenges posed by COVID-19 to essential workers, with a focus obviously on female Hispanic migrants. Dr. Natalia Dibsosa, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Really, it's an honor to be among, to have been invited by the Mexican consulate and to be among such wonderful academics. So really, really honored to be here. So first I want to do a land acknowledgement. I'm originally from Chica land. I'm from Bogota, Colombia, and we should all take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. The indigenous people have remained committed to the stewardship of the land over centuries, and we should honor and be grateful to be today on their traditional lands. I do want to recognize that we cannot have a feminist agenda without really listening and interrogating and being aware of the needs, wants, desires of women, and in particular Mexican women. And today I really want to highlight and bring to light the voices of Mexican origin women in the US, and in particular our so-called essential workers. and how they have experienced the world pandemic. The reason I began this work is because, as the previous panelists have so wonderfully addressed, women and the discourse around immigrants and Mexican has always been one around the world that has been a deficit perspective, that they, you know, and especially here in the US, that they are the ones who bring diseases, they are whatever. And when the COVID began, especially because the Latinx community was so impacted by the rates of infection and death, one of the discourses that emerged was that there had to be something wrong with their culture, with our culture, without exploring why and the systemic reasons why we were getting infected and died. So the workplace has really emerged as a central place of infection transmission. And it has been because of the measures for protecting our workers has been uneven or completely absent. And the pandemic has only deepened the labor market inequities or the health inequities. And so I think that that is something that we have to explore. But in particular, how has this been experienced by our women and Mexican origin women themselves? So one of the things that I want to highlight is that although Latinx only represent 41% of the California population, they represent at the beginning of the pandemic 59% or almost 60% of the cases of infection, but almost 74% of the deaths. The latest data point that we have, that is April 21, 2021, there are 39% of the California population. They are 56%.
I'm sorry, Dr. Deb Sosa, we cannot see. Is there a presentation that you're attempting to show us? Because it says loading, but I'm sorry, we are not able to see it. And I don't know if it's a technicality on our part or perhaps on your computer. I just wanted to let you know.
Oh, thank you. I will try to do it again.
One of our participants, one of our viewers also is very interested in seeing it. So Nora Aldwin, thank you for letting us know.
Can you see it now?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. I'm not very techy. So thank you for letting me know, Nora. One of my students, so shout out. So as I was mentioning, still even now, more than a year that has gone by, our community is still overrepresented in the cases that are infection rates and in the deaths. So, so who is deemed an essential worker? Are, according to Gavin Newsom, the executive order, are those who are deemed critical for the infrastructure sectors and additional sectors. One of the sectors have been food and agricultural sector. So the objective has always been, how are they themselves experiencing the compounding vulnerabilities? How are they, what are their needs? But also, as the other presenters have so well described, what is their resilience? What are their strengths? And what are their assets? So up to this time, we have collected 80 interviews with essential workers, and I say we because I haven't done it alone. I have collected up to date 35 of these interviews, but others have been conducted by my wonderful students, many of whom are themselves essential workers or their parents are essential workers. Most of these essential workers, which have been local in Yolo County, are born in Mexico, and many from Michoacán, Jalisco, Guanajuato, Oaxaca, Nayarit. And most of them, these were conducted in Spanish, and most of the interviewees were women. So I do want to thank them for trusting us, for sharing their lives, their resilience, their strength, and in particular, how they are experiencing this pandemic. So I want to share with you today just two of the case studies. The first one is of a farm worker. She's Mexican. She came to the US in 1988, and at the time of the interview got paid $13.50. One of the questions I asked her is, what brought you to the US? And she said, helping my parents financially. And again, this is my translation. My dad, a lot of debts, a lot of poverty. My mom has always been sick. It was that helping them. To date, I try to help them even a little, always being on the lookout. Recently, my mom fell and broke her shoulder. My grandmother has cancer. They are needing a lot of help. It's sad. My dad had gangrene. They needed a lot of help. Then I asked her work in the fields and working conditions. Here, since I arrived, I worked in the fields. From there, I have always been looking for work in the field. The bad thing is that I always get dizzy. I always get sick. The sun hurts me a lot. Yes, I pray to God I have my health to continue because I need to help my family with the rent and the needs here. Because if we don't pay the rent, they run us out. You see, they talk about essential workers, but there we are exposed to everything: chemicals, fire, harassment, COVID-19, and many very strong things. To everything, we are there in the open air. They don't provide gloves. They do not provide you with glasses or a mask. So I asked her, what does the classification of essential worker mean to you? She answered that they are the people who are needed right now, going through these difficult moments, that you are exposed to the outside, to the disease that is roaming everywhere. The product from the field is what is needed to eat. If you don't cut it, as in other states, all that product is lost. I say that if it is not full of workers, who is going to do it? We need to be there. They need help. They help us with the work, with the salary, and we contribute the work. But with the pandemic, they gave us nothing. They only gave us one tuck. And for protection that first day, they gave us the normal plastic gloves that we use, but those don't last for the whole season because they break for the moment. And when they were the fires, we have to be there to do the work. Even if it was like that, all black, all that ash falling, breathing all that, nothing, not a mask, not gloves, just nothing, just work. Now I want to share with you the second case study that is from a poultry worker. She's also Mexican, gets paid only $13 an hour at the time of the interview. And she had had twice COVID as of January 2021 when I interviewed her. And according to the company, she had only been told that there had been between 9 and 12 people who had died of COVID-19. So I asked her the kinds of work she had had since she had arrived. And she said, when I arrived, I started taking care of some children, taking care of them like a babysitter. And I didn't know anything. After that, I started going to work. I went to school for about 2 years. I went to school, but for adults. I studied 2 years. I started from the bottom, the alphabet, but I do speak English, not very well, but more or less. That has helped a lot. Yes, I worked in the fields. I also worked sweeping almonds in the field. It is very heavy. Later, when I had the opportunity to get my papers, I already started working in the poultry industry because there they ask for papers. That's where I started working. Until now, I am working there for many years. So I asked her what kind of work she does there. What I do is pack. I pack the thigh that comes boneless. I pack it after I cut it with a machine. I remove the bone and I'm already putting it aside where it is good. The salvage, what I cut, the bad, I put aside. Also, I do the hanging. I hang the pieces of the thigh with bone. Those go to the line, which is very intense, and I am hanging it. We are 4 people. Each one hangs a piece. The line goes very fast, and one has to be there. One does not have to let one pass. Sometimes they watch over you, so that doesn't happen to you, but sometimes it does happen. And then I asked about people getting sick, and this was her response. Yes, right now in my line, people are getting sick. They have come down sick. I don't know how many. I was recently tested, but I was negative. Thank God. Some are testing positive. I work where they put dividers. It is not very far apart, but they put it up so that people are not too close together in the packing area. Where one cuts, they also put up dividers too. Where you hang the chicken pieces up, they didn't put up dividers because you can't. We are 4 and we are close together. There, I do not know why they didn't put up anything, or it cannot be done. I do not know. It might be because the line goes through very fast and they didn't put anything up. Already there at work, they told me that starting January 2021, they're going to give the COVID test twice a week. They gave us hand sanitizers. We wear a mask made out of plastic. But anyway, people still get sick. So I asked her about hazard pay and pay sick leave, and this was her response. Good thing you asked me that. There, according to them, they say they paid 2 weeks, 80 hours. When I got sick of COVID, I got sick in July, and it was a whole month during which they told me they were going to pay me, but they didn't pay me anything. Every week I would tell him, hey, they haven't paid me. I need money. He would respond, yes, we will pay you. I fought to get paid, but they didn't pay me 80 hours. They paid me 1 week and 3 days. I fought so they could pay me. I spoke to them. What was wrong? No, we are going to pay you. Many people were only paid 1 week, another 3 days, but they don't pay 80 hours, as they say. No, that is what they are doing with all the people. They do not pay what they say. 80 hours? No, that's not true that they pay that. Some are paid, but most are not, because some people have told me that they have not been paid. They have been paid 3 days, others a week. They do not pay for 80 hours, as they say. No. And then I asked, have you had to pay for your own mask, for your gloves, for your personal protection? And she answered, the first time they gave us 2 pieces of cloth. They were yellow. They were pieces of cloth to protect us, just that they gave us cloth. but later they gave us a plastic helmet. I didn't use it. Nobody used it because it hurt a lot. Here, it left me red. My head hurt a lot. At Costco, I bought those masks and I used the one, and it's the one I use. At Christmas, they gave us a mask. It's blue. That was it. Just that was our gift. With a candy cane, those that are red and white, it was a small cane. They just gave that away. What they gave us did not help us. Everyone had a headache. I heard, not just me, everyone. Nobody at work is using what they gave because it didn't work. So what changes should the company make to protect you and your colleagues from the pandemic? Was the question I asked. So she answered, I think it could be as many people go, I think fewer people to go out to eat, for example, when you take a lunch break, have fewer people because you use a microwave and the people use it. When I go to heat the food, I use alcohol to wipe it down and open the door. When I take out my lunch, I clean it from the bottom. The table where I am going to sit, I also clean it with alcohol, as well as my bag. I try to take care of myself to do that, but I think they should have fewer people. I say to eat or take a lunch break so that fewer people are in the dining room. Yes, they're doing it, but it is not a few people because they come from other lines and other work areas because we work there. I think there are about 3,000 people, many people, many. So I finally asked her, how is she dealing with the pandemic? And this was her response. With the pandemic, the simple truth is that I'm afraid of bringing the disease here at my home. That's why I take care of myself. As I say, when I go in, I put my lunch, I clean it, I clean the bag. Before coming, I clean it too. I open the door with an alcohol wipe, but I don't feel like an essential worker. I feel scared. It's scary. I don't feel essential because they don't want to stop. They don't want to close. One goes with fear that one is going to bring COVID home. One has to work anyway. If you don't work, they'll fire you. They say you already know that if you don't show up for work, they don't pay you. They don't pay you for the day. They mark you as off. You have to report to work. So in conclusion, they are essential workers, but they are treated as disposable. They are really disconcerted by the huge variation in their employer's commitment to their safety and to the provision of protective gear. They're very anxious because they have lost income due to the job losses and wage losses. They have elevated stress, anxiety, and depression because they have had to self-isolate and because they have not been able to grieve all those that they have lost, not only here in the US, but also in Mexico. And they are, as the last quote revealed, they're very concerned about bringing the virus home, infecting their family, their co-workers, and their loved ones. So I share this because if we are to have a feminist agenda, we need to take into consideration what the women are dealing with in order to do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Natalia Dib Sosa. What a pressing and urgent subject to study and to ponder on and to reflect and see how we can all pitch in and help under these very, very challenging times. What a wonderful way to end our panel. I will just take 2 minutes to comment on, well, we heard, as I said, thank you, Dr. Camila Townsend from Rutgers University, who spoke about La Malinche. Thank again, Dr. Margaret Chowning, Professor of History at University of California, Berkeley, who spoke to us about women in politics during the 19th century. And obviously, Itza Varela Huerta, Dr. Itza Varela Huerta, Gender Studies at El Colegio de Mexico, who highlighted the role of Afro-Mexican women. But again, we close off with this incredibly important and pressing issue with Dr. Natalia Deeb Sosa, University of California, Davis, about the challenges, very complex challenges faced during COVID-19 by essential workers and female Latinx, particularly migrants. I do want to highlight that the Mexican consulate obviously has as a priority, not only this one, but the 10 consulates of Mexico in California, 50 consulates in the United States. Our priority is to safeguard and protect the rights and the interests of Mexico and of Mexican nationals. Our protection department is our utmost priority department, as well as documentation, of course, because our nationals need documentation to access many of the protections and the resources, the financial help that is being given by the California government to essential workers. But the protection department at the consulates has a very important network of strategic allies that include the Department of Agriculture and the agricultural commissioners per county, as well as EDD, but also migrant rights organizations such as California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, obviously UC Davis Law School with Dean Kevin Johnson being an incredible ally, as well as the law professors and law students that help the consulate in various ways. But El Concilio in Stockton and San Joaquin and Stanislaus County, where we have over 500,000 Mexican nationals, most of them working in agriculture. So I do want to let everyone know that we are seeking further collaboration and looking forward to cooperate further with all these strategic allies to be able to get the information out there to our nationals regarding know your rights. Everything that Dr. Deeb Sosa mentioned as to if they're not getting paid what they're supposed to get paid, if they're not getting the protective gear that they're entitled to and they should receive, and so many other protections. We are here as a consulate to work hand in hand with the authorities and with legal representatives, free of charge, paid by the Mexican government, to make sure that their rights are respected. So I did want to put that out there, and I want to end with opening it up just a couple of minutes, and perhaps maybe you can share your thoughts with us, Dr. Deeb Sosa. What are some of the most immediate recommendations that you would make to us regarding how best we can help educate, we can help protect, and also thank you for highlighting the importance of the challenge of mental health, anxiety, and depression that has impacted all of us, but obviously some much more than others, and the Latinx communities and the migrant communities, because of the circumstances that they live in and the lack of support and protections and help are most impacted. So what are your recommendations? And if you could do us the honor of closing with this very important subject, Dr. Deeb Sosa.
Oh, thank you. I don't want to take the whole time because I think everybody will have something to say. So I just put it in the chat because I think that this is very important, that we should all be really advocating for a path to citizenship, making sure that everybody has healthcare, regardless of documentation status, making sure that everybody has access to safety support network, regardless of documentation status, as well as making sure that the essential workers are part of the conversation of how to make their workplace safer, and making sure about SB 562, about California for a Healthy California Act. And I think also making sure that everybody knows about the Ventanillas de Salud and other access to care and mental health that the consul provides, so, and vaccines that a consul has been doing as well. So thank you for the great work that you are doing and for really providing for for everybody that space to get access to that. So muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. The Ventanilla de Salud, we have vaccines available for everyone every day here at the consulate, Monday through Friday. But we are also going out. We're going to be having one in a couple of weeks at Santuario de Guadalupe. We're also going out to Stockton and Modesto, hand in hand with El Concilio, trying to get vaccines available to all. And we have COVID-19 testings as well on site, and mental health therapists and specialists free of charge for our community. So please contact the Mexican consulate and help our communities contact the Mexican consulate, those of you that are listening to this panel. I want to once again just close by thanking our wonderful, wonderful group of academics, all powerful and very respected women leaders in academia. I think that one of the beauties of these type of events is that amongst women or amongst just experts in a particular subject, we can all get together and discuss issues of common concern or of common interest. In this case, gender issues, women issues that are so relevant in today's world. So once again, Dr. Camila Townsend, Dr. Margaret Chowning, Dr. Itza Varela Huerta, and Dr. Natalia Deep Sosa, on behalf of the Mexican Consulate General, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a true privilege. Thank you for participating and closing off in the last day of Mexico, California Advocacy Week. And we're going to put that MOU that we just signed on gender issues, on women's issues with the government of California, we're going to put it to good use. I've taken copious notes of all your recommendations, Dr. Deep Sosa, and that's going to be one of our starting points, getting help to our community and to the women in our community. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.